I don't know how to describe what I'm about to tell you. It's like a lot of what is said about the supernatural that many would decide not to believe. It took me years to believe it myself until I experienced it. Friends very close to me swore they were sure that I told them the truth to tell them, and then I literally saw them, running from my house scared to death. This story begins in my grandmother's house since my grandfather died when they were both almost 70 years old. My grandmother decided to bring with her to live with her cousin Mercedes, a few years older than her. This aunt never married, so since I was a child my memories of visiting my grandmother were also memories of Aunt Mercedes, who terrified me, always dressed in black in permanent mourning for her parents. Although my mother and my aunts swear that she was a very gentle person, I was never able to look at her without fear. I remember her always watching me from afar in a hallway on the other side of the house, or from her window while I was playing in the yard. He never scolded me, we didn't talk much beyond greetings, but I always had the feeling that he was waiting for me to do some mischief so he could start yelling at me. Some years later, when my Aunt Mercedes died, I remember how scared I was to get close to seeing her body. The coffin, I was already 14 years old, but I was terrified. I asked my mother not to force me to be present at the wake, and she gave me permission to go to my grandmother's house where an aunt was with some of the younger cousins. To those who did not want to expose them to the atmosphere of the funeral home, I perfectly remember the dream I had that night, in which I entered the funeral home looking for my mother or my grandmother, but I couldn't find anyone. I walked through the entire room until I reached the room where they were watching over my aunt. Upon entering that completely empty room, something gave me the courage to go see the body, perhaps being somewhat aware that it was a dream, but as I took the steps the coffin made a small movement, its long fingers, skinny hands of the aunt's right hand, they began to peek out of the coffin, holding on as if they were about to get up. When I turned around to run away, I ran into the doors of the closed rooms, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't open them, and suddenly a loud sound behind me made me turn around again, yes, to the coffin now on the empty ground. Then I woke up with a fever. I don't remember much else, only that I was in bed for several days. In my family we never fully believed in ghosts, although we enjoyed the stories. When my grandmother told us that Aunt Mercedes kept walking through the hallways of the house, we thought it was a story to scare us or the imagination of a lady who was already getting older. 2 days then one of my uncles and some cousins, there were almost 8 of us visiting my grandmother that day, when someone mentioned Aunt Mercedes, and we froze when we heard Aunt's loud laughter filling the house, coming from the second floor, empty except for the baby who was sleeping in one of the rooms. It was my uncle Julian who was the first to overcome the shock and ran up to get the baby to quickly take it down and give it to his mother. My grandmother was the least surprised. She had already told us from the death of her aunt, who was still in the house, and no one had believed her until that moment. From then on we all took turns, but from that day on the grandmother was never alone in the house again. And I remember very well one day in particular when I stayed with her. I was playing with a ball in the yard while my grandmother was knitting, sitting in a chair under one of the trees. I accidentally sent the ball into a rose bush, breaking a large branch with some roses. My grandmother told me he said that nothing was happening and he went over to pick them up. He turned towards the house and there was the aunt from the usual window, watching me as if she were about to jump for me. When I was in high school, my grandmother died. The house was inherited from my mother and she and I went to live there, respecting her memory and her aunt's presence as much as we could, and at the university when we do teamwork there at home because it is the closest to the school, I always tried to welcome my classmates with a ghost story about Aunt Mercedes, that aunt who lived on the upper floor, and more than to break the ice she was always trying to prevent them. A friend she was going out with when she just went up to the second floor to use the bathroom upstairs, when Bass told me that an old woman in black had given him a big scare who would have warned him that there were more people in the house. Shortly after they stopped going out, and I didn't think it was necessary to explain to him that that day he had encountered a ghost, so since then warn all visitors, always trying to be serious, always trying to prepare them for the steps in the hallway, for the doors of the rooms closing, for the bathroom faucets to suddenly be heard opening, On one occasion the boyfriend of one of my classmates came to help us with a job. He was a little older than her and all of us, and every time he could he would insult us, making us see that we were young and inexperienced, and he felt mature and knowledgeable in all the topics we discussed. When Aunt Mercedes came up with the topic, he began to make fun of us, so I asked him to go up to the second floor. After all, the house was alone that night and he wasn't going to bother anyone. He went up to where I told him it was his aunt's room, and he came down very shortly after, smiling but pale. I continued to insist that it was our marginalization, although later, in the kitchen, he approached me to tell me that he was sure he had seen a woman in the corner of the room in the darkness with her back turned, as if leaning her forehead against the wall but floating. I told him that that was something that not even I had seen, and the truth is that I couldn't bear to see. A laugh was heard from the floor above. We all approached the room where we had the things again. When we were together, a burst of laughter chilled our blood, and then a few steps descending the stairs. And here he clarified that this is something that I had not heard before from the aunt who dared to come down. Before I could react, my companions had run out of the house, leaving almost all their things. They spoke for phone minutes later, saying that a friend would stop by in the morning to help me carry everything to school, and the skeptical boyfriend didn't even want to go back in to get his backpack and his girlfriend's bag. It was the last time, of course, we worked on my home. I do believe that it is possible, although with fear, to adapt to living with these presences. This is what we have done. Thank you for reading my story.